The auditorium was electric with tension as the two high school students faced off on the debate stage. Karen, a local PTA busybody, sat in the front row, her eyes narrowed with determination. Her son, Bryce, was about to face off against the school's debate team champion, a quiet and unassuming sophomore named Liam. From the moment the debate began, it was clear that Liam was the superior orator. His arguments were sharp, his logic flawless, and his delivery captivating. Bryce, on the other hand, stumbled over his words and struggled to counter Liam's points. As the minutes ticked by, Karen could feel her face growing hot with embarrassment and rage. How dare this nobody of a student humiliate her precious Bryce in front of the entire school? She clenched her fists, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. When the judges announced Liam as the winner, Karen leaped to her feet, her shrill voice echoing through the auditorium. "This is an outrage," she shrieked. "My son is the superior debater, and you all know it. This is clearly a biased decision, and I demand a recount." The crowd fell silent, all eyes turning to the irate woman in the front row. Liam's face flushed with discomfort, while Bryce sank lower in his seat, wishing the earth would swallow him whole. Principal Daniels, a seasoned administrator with a no-nonsense demeanor, strode to the microphone, his expression stern. "Mrs. Walters, I must ask you to leave the premises immediately," he said, his voice firm. "Your behavior is unacceptable and will not be tolerated in this school." Karen's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment she was speechless. Then her face contorted with rage, and she rounded on the principal. "You can't do this to me," she shouted. "I am the president of the PTA, and I demand respect. This is an outrage, and I won't stand for it." But Principal Daniels was unmoved. He gestured to the security guards standing nearby, who promptly escorted the irate woman from the auditorium, her shrieks of protest echoing down the hallway. As the doors slammed shut behind her, the audience erupted into hushed murmurs, all of them processing the bizarre and unsettling scene they had just witnessed. Liam, still reeling from the confrontation, approached Bryce, his expression a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. "Hey man, I'm really sorry about that," he said, placing a hand on Bryce's shoulder. "Your mom's behavior was totally out of line." Bryce, his face flushed with embarrassment, could only nod mutely, wishing he could disappear into the floor. Little did he know that this was just the beginning of a series of events that would test the limits of his mother's entitled behavior and the consequences that would follow. The following Monday, Karen stormed into Principal Daniels' office, her perfectly coiffed hair and designer suit belying the storm brewing within. "I demand that you expel that Liam boy immediately," she declared, slamming her perfectly manicured hand on the desk. "He humiliated my son in front of the entire school, and I won't stand for it." Principal Daniels regarded her calmly, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Walters, I'm afraid I cannot expel Liam based on your demands. The debate competition was judged fairly, and Liam was the clear winner." Karen's face flushed with indignation. "But he must have cheated," she insisted. "There's no way my son could have lost to that scrawny little nobody." The principal shook his head. "I'm sorry, but I've reviewed the footage, and Liam's performance was exemplary. He won fair and square." "That's unacceptable," Karen screeched. "I demand that you discipline that boy immediately, or I'll have your job." Principal Daniels sighed, already weary of this encounter. "Mrs. Walters, I understand that you're upset, but threatening me will not change the outcome. Liam has done nothing wrong, and I have no grounds to punish him." Karen's eyes narrowed, and a twisted smile spread across her lips. "Oh, we'll see about that," she murmured, her voice dripping with malice. With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the office, her heels clicking ominously against the linoleum floor. Over the next few days, Karen set her plan in motion. She began spreading rumors among the other PTA members, painting Liam as a troublemaker and a threat to the school's reputation. She even went so far as to fabricate a story about Liam bullying her son, complete with a forged letter from a concerned parent. Armed with this evidence, Karen marched back into Principal Daniel's office, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "I have proof that Liam has been harassing and bullying my son," she declared, slamming the forged letter onto his desk. "You have no choice but to expel him immediately." Principal Daniels studied the letter, his brow furrowed in concern. "This is a serious accusation, Mrs. Walters. I'll need to investigate further before taking any disciplinary action." "There's nothing to investigate," Karen snapped. "The evidence is right there. Now, do your job and get that boy out of this school, or I'll make sure you never work in education again." But unbeknownst to Karen, the principal was no fool. He had a keen eye for detail, and something about the letter didn't sit right with him. He quietly instructed the school's 8 staff to examine the document for any signs of forgery. The results of the investigation would soon shatter Karen's carefully constructed web of lies, and the consequences of her actions would come crashing down around her. Over the next few days, Principal Daniels conducted a thorough investigation into the allegations against Liam. He interviewed teachers, staff, and students, but none of them could corroborate Karen's claims of bullying. In fact, many of them praised Liam as a quiet, diligent, and respectful student. Suspecting that something was amiss, the principal turned his attention to the forged letter that Karen had presented as evidence. The school's 8 team quickly determined that the document had been fabricated, with telltale signs of computer-generated text and signatures. Furious at the discovery of Karen's deception, Principal Daniels summoned her to his office once again. The irate woman stormed in, her face flushed with anger. "I demand to know why you haven't expelled that Liam boy yet," she spat. The principal held up a hand, silencing her. "Mrs. Walters, I've conducted a thorough investigation, and I can say with certainty that the letter you presented was forged. There is no evidence to support your claims of Liam bullying your son." Karen's eyes widened, and for a moment she was speechless. Then her expression twisted into one of pure rage. "This is an outrage," she shrieked. "I demand that you take action against that boy immediately. He's a menace to this school, and I won't rest until he's gone." Principal Daniels shook his head, his expression grim. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Mrs. Walters. Your actions have been nothing short of despicable. You've attempted to ruin a young man's life based on lies and fabricated evidence. That is completely unacceptable." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Furthermore, I've received numerous complaints from other parents and teachers about your behavior. They've expressed concerns about your constant meddling and attempts to influence school decisions. I'm afraid that your actions have consequences, and I have no choice but to take disciplinary action against you." Karen's face paled, and she stumbled backward, her perfectly manicured hands trembling. "You can't do this to me," she cried. "I'm the president of the PTA. I have influence and power in this community." The principal shook his head, his expression unwavering. "Not anymore, Mrs. Walters. Effective immediately, you are banned from school property and all PTA-related activities. If you set foot on school grounds again, I will have you arrested for trespassing." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the words died on her lips. She turned and fled the office, her designer heels clicking frantically against the linoleum floor. As she raced to her car, tears of rage and humiliation streaming down her face, Karen knew that her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. The consequences of her entitled behavior were finally catching up with her, and she had no one to blame but herself. News of Karen's attempted sabotage of Liam quickly spread throughout the community, and the backlash was swift and brutal. Parents and teachers who had long been frustrated with her entitled behavior and constant meddling in school affairs seized the opportunity to call her out. Social media was ablaze with posts condemning Karen's actions, with many calling for her removal from the PTA and demanding that the school take disciplinary action against her. The hashtag Hashtag Karen Got Karma began trending as people across the country celebrated the downfall of yet another entitled, privileged individual. Even Bryce, Karen's own son, found himself caught in the crossfire. His peers, disgusted by his mother's behavior, began to ostracize him, leaving him feeling ashamed and isolated. Bryce tried to distance himself from the situation, but the damage had already been done. Meanwhile, Karen's reputation in the community was in tatters. She found herself shunned by her former PTA allies, who now viewed her as a liability and a pariah. Her attempts to defend herself only seemed to make matters worse as she continued to lash out and make excuses for her actions. As the fallout continued to unfold, Karen began to realize the true extent of the consequences she was facing. She had not only jeopardized her own standing in the community, but had also put her son's well-being at risk. The realization that her entitled behavior had spiraled so far out of control left her feeling overwhelmed and uncertain about the future. In a last-ditch effort to salvage her reputation, Karen reached out to a local news outlet, hoping to spin the narrative in her favor. However, her pleas for sympathy and understanding fell on deaf ears, as the reporters saw through her attempts at manipulation and instead exposed the full extent of her misdeeds. The resulting news story, which detailed Karen's shocking behavior and the school's swift response, further fueled the public outcry. Suddenly, the once influential PTA president found herself the subject of widespread ridicule and condemnation, with many calling for her to be held accountable for her actions. As the dust began to settle, Karen was left to face the harsh reality of her situation. Her entitled behavior had cost her dearly, and the consequences were proving to be far more severe than she could have ever imagined. Reeling from the public backlash and the loss of her position in the PTA, Karen knew she had to take drastic action to salvage her reputation and regain some semblance of control over the situation. In a last-ditch effort, she reached out to a local politician, a close friend of her family, and begged him for help. The politician, sensing an opportunity to curry favor with Karen's influential social circle, agreed to intervene on her behalf. Within days, the politician began making calls and exerting pressure on the school district, demanding that Principal Daniels be held accountable for his unfair treatment of Karen. He even threatened to withhold funding for the school's upcoming renovations if the principal didn't back down. Unaware of the politician's involvement, Principal Daniels stood firm in his decision, refusing to give in to Karen's demands or the political pressure being applied. He knew that if he capitulated, it would set a dangerous precedent and undermine the integrity of the school's disciplinary policies. As the standoff continued, Karen grew increasingly desperate, sinking deeper into a spiral of manipulation and deceit. She began contacting other local officials, offering promises of financial support and political influence in exchange for their help in ousting the principal. However, the more Karen tried to manipulate the system, the more her actions were exposed. Word of her underhanded tactics quickly spread, further eroding what little public sympathy she had managed to retain. Realizing that her political connections were no longer enough to save her, Karen turned to more drastic measures. She began making anonymous phone calls to the local media, painting herself as the victim of a corrupt and vindictive school administration. But the reporters, having already investigated the case, saw through her attempts at manipulation. They instead focused their attention on exposing the web of lies and deceit that Karen had woven, further tarnishing her reputation and undermining her credibility. As the pressure mounted, Karen found herself cornered, her once formidable influence and power rapidly slipping through her fingers. She had underestimated the strength of the community's outrage and the unwavering resolve of the school's leadership. With nowhere left to turn, Karen was forced to confront the harsh reality of her situation, a reality of her own making, a consequence of her entitled and unethical behavior. The realization that she had lost everything, including the respect and trust of her own son, was a bitter pill to swallow. As the public scrutiny and backlash continued to intensify, Karen found herself at a crossroads. Her desperate attempts to salvage her reputation and regain her influence had only served to further erode the trust and goodwill of those around her. Realizing that her usual tactics of manipulation and entitlement were no longer working, Karen began to reflect on the actions that had led her to this point. She could no longer ignore the fact that her own behavior had been the driving force behind her downfall. Slowly, a realization dawned on her. If she wanted any chance of reclaiming her standing in the community, she would have to make a genuine effort to change. But the path to redemption would not be an easy one, and Karen knew that she would have to confront her own flaws and shortcomings head-on. Summoning her courage, Karen reached out to Principal Daniels, requesting a meeting. The principal, initially wary of her motives, agreed to hear her out, curious to see if she had truly had a change of heart. When they met, Karen's demeanor was markedly different from their previous encounters. Gone was the entitled, combative attitude, replaced by a humble and contrite expression. She acknowledged her wrongdoings, admitting that her attempts to have Liam expelled were based on lies and a desire for power rather than any legitimate concerns. "I was wrong," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I let my own ego and need for control cloud my judgment, and I hurt a lot of people in the process. I'm truly sorry, and I hope that someday I can make amends." Principal Daniels listened, his expression unreadable. He knew that this moment could be a turning point, not just for Karen, but for the entire community. If she was sincere in her desire for redemption, it could be the first step towards healing the deep divisions that had been created. "Mrs. Walters, I appreciate your honesty," he said, his tone measured. "But actions speak louder than words. If you're truly serious about making amends, then you'll need to demonstrate that through your future behavior." Karen nodded, her eyes downcast. "I understand. I know I have a long way to go, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to regain the trust and respect of this community." With that, she turned and left the principal's office, her steps heavy with the weight of the task ahead. She knew that the road to redemption would not be an easy one. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope that she could reclaim her standing and, more importantly, the love and respect of her son. In the weeks that followed her meeting with Principal Daniels, Karen set out on a path of redemption, determined to make amends for her past transgressions. It was not an easy journey. She knew that she had a long way to go to regain the trust and respect of the community she had once dominated. First, she reached out to Liam, the young debate champion she had so viciously tried to destroy. Swallowing her pride, she apologized sincerely, acknowledging the harm her actions had caused and the unjust ordeal he had been put through. To Karen's surprise, Liam was gracious in his acceptance of her apology. He understood that admitting one's mistakes and seeking forgiveness was a difficult and humbling process. With empathy and wisdom beyond his years, Liam expressed a willingness to move forward, and even offered to help Karen in her efforts to make amends. Emboldened by this unexpected show of compassion, Karen then turned her attention to her son, Bryce. She knew that her actions had deeply wounded him, and she was determined to repair the rift that had formed between them. Over a series of heartfelt conversations, Karen opened up to Bryce, acknowledging the ways in which her entitled behavior had negatively impacted him. She apologized for the embarrassment and isolation he had endured, and promised to be a better, more supportive parent moving forward. To Karen's relief, Bryce was receptive to her overtures. He could see the genuine remorse in her eyes and the sincerity of her words. Slowly, the walls of resentment began to crumble, and the two embarked on a journey of rebuilding their relationship. With her family on a path to healing, Karen next set her sights on the broader community. She reached out to the PTA members she had once lorded over, humbly requesting the opportunity to make amends and regain their trust. To her surprise, many were willing to give her a second chance, impressed by the humility and determination she now displayed. Karen threw herself into volunteer work, organizing fundraisers and community events that showcased her newfound commitment to the school and its students. She listened to the concerns of parents and teachers, and worked tirelessly to address their needs and rebuild bridges that had been burned. Gradually, the community began to see a different side of Karen, one that was selfless, compassionate, and genuinely invested in the well-being of the school and its students. The transformation was not an overnight success, but it was a testament to the power of redemption and the resilience of the human spirit. As Karen's story spread, it became a beacon of hope for others who had struggled with the consequences of their own entitled behavior. Her journey had proven that even the most entrenched patterns of thought and behavior could be changed, if one was willing to put in the hard work and face their own shortcomings head-on. As the months passed, Karen's journey of redemption continued to unfold, marked by both challenges and triumphs. While the initial steps had been the most difficult, she found that with each act of selflessness and humility, the path ahead became a little clearer. One of Karen's most significant milestones came when she was invited to address the student body at Lamb's High School. Nervously, she stood before the assembly, prepared to deliver a heartfelt apology and a message of hope. "When I look out at all of you, I see the potential for greatness," Karen began, her voice steady and sincere. "But I also see the scars that my own entitled and selfish behavior has left on this community. I stand before you today, not as the PTA president I once was, but as a person who has learned the hard way that true power comes not from manipulation or influence, but from empathy, honesty, and a genuine desire to make a difference." Karen went on to recount her journey, detailing the mistakes she had made and the painful process of confronting her own flaws. She spoke of the importance of accountability and the transformative power of taking responsibility for one's actions. "I know that I can never fully undo the harm I've caused," she admitted, "but I am committed to spending the rest of my life making amends. I hope that by sharing my story, I can inspire others to have the courage to confront their own weaknesses and strive for a better, more compassionate world." As Karen's speech drew to a close, the auditorium was filled with a hushed silence. Then, slowly, a smattering of applause began to build, until the room erupted in a thunderous ovation. Students and teachers alike rose to their feet, their expressions a mix of awe, respect, and even forgiveness. In that moment, Karen knew that she had finally found the redemption she had sought. The road ahead would still be long and difficult, but she was no longer alone. She had the support of a community that had once written her off, but now saw in her a beacon of hope and the possibility of change. As Karen stepped down from the podium, she caught sight of Liam, his face beaming with pride. The young man approached her, extending his hand in a gesture of friendship and solidarity. "Thank you," he said simply, "for having the courage to become the person you were meant to be." In that moment, Karen knew that she had been given a second chance, one that she was determined to make the most of, not just for herself, but for the betterment of all those around her.